the chairman of Boston Global Forum. Boston Global Forum is something that was the brainchild of a wonderful man named Tuan Nguyen, founder of the Internet in Vietnam, who now spends a good deal of his time in Boston and in Cambridge, but also returns to Vietnam as well for several months during the year. And it was his idea to create the Boston Global Forum to tap into the rich intellectual and policy resources that we have here in the Boston area, and at the same time invite people from all over the world to participate in what we were doing through online conferences, and one of those online conferences is the one that we're having this evening. We decided that what we would do is to focus on one important international issue every year and see if we could come up with some constructive solutions for that particular issue or problem. We began our first year with the issue of occupational safety and health standards around the world after the tragedies in Bangladesh. This year, we decided to focus on another very important topic: building a framework for peace and security in the Pacific. I don't have to tell any of you that the Pacific area these days is fraught with problems. These dozen countries arguing over who owns what island, serious concerns about the ambitions of some of those countries, in some cases historic rivalries which go back centuries and certainly back to World War II. And yet, in many ways, in our view, the Pacific could be a model of how to create a region of the world in which nations come together, reason together, and create rules and institutions which will make it possible for them to solve their problems without resorting to arms or force. And so tonight, with your cooperation and your participation, and with the help of a really distinguished group of people, some of whom are with us here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and some of them will be talking to us from all over the globe, we're going to begin our discussion of this very important topic. How does the international community create a framework for peace and security in the Pacific? We'll be having two more online conferences, one in November, one in December. And we hope by the end of this year to have a series of recommendations which will help to lead in the direction that can help to fashion. And we're going to begin tonight with a panel which will be followed by two other panels in which we will have people both here in Cambridge and around the globe participating through the modern miracle of an online conference. We welcome you, welcome your participation, your thoughts, and we hope you will be very much a part of what we expect will be a real contribution to peace in the world and peace in the Pacific. And we're going to begin our panel with an opening statement from the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Mike Fuchs, who was responsible for the United States' approach to multilateralism and multilateral institutions. He speaks to us tonight from Washington, and we're delighted to have him with us. Mike, you're on.
Thank you very much, Governor Dukakis. And again, let me thank you to start and others as well at Boston Global Forum for organizing this series of conversations, which I think is obviously both very important and very timely with events going on in the region in recent months and years. I wanted to start with the big picture, and again, I hope I will not go on too long and I know there are a lot of great speakers, and I see a lot of friendly faces around the computer screen here, and so I know it'll be a great discussion tonight on the three panels. So I thought what I would do is just start for a couple of minutes and give our perspective on the big picture in the region and some of the challenges that we see the region as facing and what we believe is essential piece of the framework that I think that you're talking about to help ensure that the countries in the region and the United States can figure out constructive solutions to problem solving, as you put it, Governor Dukakis. So first, obviously, we all know why this region is important. We all know why it matters, not just for what happens in the region, but what happens beyond the reaches of the Asia-Pacific. And the economic growth, the dynamism, there are a lot of reasons why our engagement in the Asia-Pacific is important, not just for the United States, not just for the region, but for beyond. But at the same time, obviously, I think we're all very clear in the understanding that as the economic dynamism in many ways has taken off in recent decades in the Asia-Pacific, at the same time we have seen a series of real serious challenges, threats, rise as well and become more complex as this economic dynamism has taken off and as interdependence within the region has expanded. And I think that the question put to everyone here today by the Boston Global Forum is the right one, which is how do we build, how do we construct framework in the region, their ugly heads? How can the countries of the region come together and find a amicable way, peaceful way to address these disputes? The first thing that I would put out there and say is that before getting to the framework piece is that one piece of the framework that we think is absolutely essential, and our senior leadership, obviously, in the U.S. government has reiterated this point time and again, is the importance of U.S. alliances in the region to regional peace, stability, and prosperity. These are long-standing alliances that we are doing a lot of work right now and have over the last handful of years to strengthen. Because we believe they're not just in our interests and not just in the interests of our allies, but they are in the interests of the entire region. And for decades have helped underpin regional peace and stability and prosperity. And so that is one piece that we, again, continue to strengthen because we believe it is in everyone's interest in upholding this framework that I think we all have an interest in constructing. Taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture of what a framework might look like, the first thing I would say is that international law and norms provide much of the context and substance, I think, for what we want to see in this region. We don't have to go very far to look for some of the answers that, frankly, many of the countries, if not all of them, have already agreed to in trying to figure out how do we resolve certain disputes, how do we address some of our problems. They're there in international law, in commonly accepted norms and standards. So that's the first thing that I would say I think is important for us to recognize when trying to figure out how to most constructively address the disputes and the challenges in the region. The second question, I think, is how do you actually enforce and uphold international laws and norms in the Asia-Pacific? Obviously, this is a region that has a wide variety of different bilateral, trilateral, multilateral institutions and arrangements that do a wide variety of different things, but does not have quite the same level of institutional maturity as, say, some other regions, like obviously Europe does with the EU and other organizations. So the question is, what role can these multilateral institutions and arrangements play in upholding and enforcing international laws and norms? And that's one of the big questions I think that we try to think through and try to address on the part of the U.S. government and working in conjunction with allies and partners in the region. And so the two things I want to focus on very briefly are, one, the multilateral institutions and what role they can play, and two, the specific types of issues in which I think they can help us in the region address our main challenges. So the first in the multilateral institutions, as I said, there are a wide variety of institutions out there, many of them centered on ASEAN, broadening out to the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, and a wide variety of others, but also including economic institutions like APEC, where we have invested time and energy in trying to build up the capability, not just of leaders and foreign ministers and others to get in rooms together and hash out their problems with one another, but again, try to find tangible, problem-solving oriented solutions to the main challenges in the region. And so I think that, one, the first order of business for us, at least in what we've been trying to do over the last handful of years with this administration's focus in the region, is build up these institutions. We need to strengthen them and their ability to enforce and uphold international laws and norms, to build up their ability to respond to crises and serious challenges when they arise. That, I think, is our first task. Talk about a longer-term framework for peace and stability in the region. I think that the multilateral institutions are going to need to play an absolutely central role in that framework. The second point I would make, and the last one, is giving a specific example of the type of issue that the multilateral institutions should be taking up. And I think that the maritime disputes in the South China Sea in particular, I think, are ripe for being addressed by these multilateral institutions. This is the sort of situation where you have multiple different claimants going at one another and pursuing their claims, sometimes in not peaceful ways, in ways that are provocative, in ways that are concerning to one another and to the broader region as well, and which bring with them the potential for destabilization, for increasing tensions and incidents and potential conflict. And so one of the things that in the recent years, ASEAN in particular, and we have supported ASEAN in doing this as well, is trying to find a multilateral solution to the tensions in the South China Sea. And ASEAN and China's discussions that are quite slow, I would say, but are still ongoing on how to finalize and come to agreement on a code of conduct for the South China Sea is a good example of the sort of contribution that multilateral institutions can make, I think, to solving real, tangible problems that we're faced with in the region. And I think that even though the solutions themselves may not be imminent, and we may not be able to find the answer today or tomorrow or even next month, these multilateral institutions are the place where these issues and solutions to these challenges need to be put on the table, because, frankly, there are no other venues. There are no other places where you have everyone at the table coming together to address these sorts of issues. So this is the game in town. Is what I would say. And so these are the places that we should do our best to empower to try to tackle key issues for a little while. So, and I know we've got a lot of other folks to get to, and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the discussion. So thank you again, Governor Dukakis.
Discussion this evening. We're now going to go to Bonnie Glaser, who is, I think, in some part of Asia. And Bonnie is Pacific Forum, and thank you for joining us. She's done some interesting writing on this subject. Hope you had a chance to listen to Mike Fuchs. So, you're on.
Thank you, Governor Dukakis. You are fading in and out, but hopefully you can all hear me. Would like to thank all the members of the Boston Global Forum for asking me to speak tonight, and I will try to add very briefly to Michael Fuchs's remarks. I've been asked to assess the risk of conflict for lowering tensions and averting crisis. Clearly, we should be looking at the East China Sea and the South China Sea. There are some important differences, but when it comes to making recommendations of ways to lower tensions, I think that there are some commonalities. If we assess the risk of conflict or accident in the East China Sea, we can see that since the government in Tokyo purchased 3 of the 5 islands in September of 2012, there's been a real uptick in China's patrols within not only the contiguous zone, but also inside the 12-mile territorial waters around the islands. The risk of conflict, in my view, is relatively low between these law enforcement vessels. They are operating in a relatively predictable, careful manner, although an incident could occur with the introduction of unpredictable factors such as fishing boats or activists trying to land on the islands. An accident is more worrisome, I think, in the airspace where China and Japan have declared their overlapping air identification zone, air defense identification zones, or ADIZ. A contingency certainly could draw in the United States, whether in the air or at sea, because of our treaty obligations to Japan under Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty. Escalation is certainly possible, even though I think neither Japan nor China, nor, of course, the United States would see benefits accruing from a military conflict. Recently, we've seen an increase in the by Japan and China in their ADIZ, sometimes involving fighters against fighters, not just intercepting surveillance planes. And this, of course, is increasing the risk of accident, especially when rules of engagement are not known and pilots lack experience and training. And this is particularly true in the case of China. In the South China Sea, the situation is much more complicated with, of course, 6 claimants. I see it as somewhat less dangerous, except in the case of a direct U.S.-China incident or confrontation. Of course, only one of the claimants to the land features is a U.S. treaty ally, that is the Philippines. The U.S. has not stated its treaty commitments quite as clearly in the cases in Japan, but one could envisage a potential escalation, for example, in means that they have on a rusting out ship on Second Thomas Shoal, in which the U.S. has been, in fact, flying P-8s overhead and probably supplying some intelligence information to the Philippines. So to turn to the question of what can be done, Michael Fuchs has already talked about the need for a code of conduct. In the South China Sea, the discussions, of course, have been launched. Progress is very slow. I would emphasize that a COC needs to have, it needs to be legally binding, and it should have a dispute settlement mechanism. In the absence of those features, I think it will look very much like the 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties. So I think that ASEAN in particular, which is engaged in these negotiations with China, needs to ensure that this is a much more robust agreement than the original agreement in 2002. There is also a need for something like a code of conduct in the East China Sea, and that could be multilateral. It could include South Korea, it could include Taiwan, but there's certainly a case for agreed upon rules of the road both in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. In terms of very specific risk reduction measures, I'm sure you're all aware that there was some progress between China and Japan in May of 2012 when they discussed the establishment of crisis communications, including a hotline. I do think the two nations should be encouraged to resume those talks and to expand them to include the establishment of safe intercept procedures which is also, of course, an issue between the U.S. and China, as we need to establish safe intercept procedures as well. I wanted to mention the need for potential joint exploration schemes where possible. We've seen a few of those, most notably between Malaysia and Brunei. It's very difficult, of course, to engage in any kind of joint resource cooperation and exploration when there are these outstanding sovereignty disputes. But I think that this is something that should be revisited as well. Some people say that the resolution of the disputes is too hard and we should only work on managing them, but I would like to endorse the need to think harder about resolutions. We have seen partial resolutions between China and Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin in 2004. Indonesia and the Philippines just a few weeks ago, after 20 years of discussions, signed an agreement that delimits their EEZs. If all of the Southeast Asian claimants could resolve their maritime and territorial disputes, that would put pressure on China to engage in this process. So I think we should think more about that. In the South China Sea, there is a very pressing need to what I call map the area. That is, all claimants in the South China Sea should bring their claim in line with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This means China needs to resolve the ambiguity, of course, of its 9-dash line, but there are other claimants that don't have their claims in line with UNCLOS either. And there needs to be an understanding on the status of every geographic feature and the maritime zones to which it is entitled. So is it a rock, is it an island, or is it a low tide elevation? This could be done with the aid of an arbitral tribunal or a neutral third party that conducts a study of the various features. And this could help to define the areas that are disputed, areas that constitute high seas, where freedom of navigation should be respected. And finally, my last point is litigation really should not be a dirty word. I think when the Philippines took its case initially in January 2013 to the ITLOS tribunal, many countries thought that this was an act that would increase tensions. I think here we are more than a year and a half later, and many countries think that this is actually a good decision. If the arbitral tribunal finds it has jurisdiction on at least some of the points in the cases, we will see a ruling probably in late 2015 or early 2016. So the role of international legal institutions should not be ignored. They could play a very useful role. If the South China Sea claimants do not wish to submit their disputes to an international court of justice, for example, another option is to establish an impartial regional tribunal as a neutral forum for deciding island territorial disputes. And of course, in the case of Japan and China, the Japanese have said they would agree to take their case to the International Court of Justice if China would do so as well. So I think that there is a role for international arbitration, for litigation in addressing some of these disputes, and so I would encourage that to be part of the toolbox that we are using to do what our Deputy Assistant Secretary talked about in promoting the adherence to and implementation of international law and international norms. Thank you very much, Governor Dukakis.
Thanks, Bonnie. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Steve Bosworth, who until recently was the Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts, has been our ambassador to South Korea, was Secretary Clinton's special envoy to Korea, and is now at the Belfer Center, just around the corner at the Kennedy School. Steve, some thoughts and comments on what you've heard so far?
Well, first of all, I think it's a very interesting discussion, and I commend you and others for drawing together such an impressive group of people who actually know something about this issue. Just a couple of observations. First, for me, I think the central question over the next generation and beyond is how are China and the U.S. going to be able to work out a long-term relationship in which we can live with one another and live within the region. We're really talking about what is the regional order going to look like as it evolves over the next 10, 20 years. difficulty there, of course, is that we start from very different assumptions, we and the Chinese. For the Chinese, the last 150 years was a brief interruption in the normal process of the power within East Asia. For us as a nation, we've not really dealt with China as a strong power until just recently. So we each have somewhat distorted perceptions of the other, and we're going to have to work those out over time. It's not going to happen quickly. So I think many of the issues that we're going to be talking about over the next few months are, at bottom, issues of how the U.S. and how China relate to one another, how we are able to provide an atmosphere of political tranquility within which the economic progress, which is already underway in East Asia, can continue. I would hope that we can both put more emphasis than we have before, perhaps, on the trade and investment aspects of our regional relationship. I think that the TPP, as it's known, is one of the key ingredients for long-term stability in East Asia and for advancing our interests and the interests of other countries in the region.
And TPP means what?
Trans-Pacific Partnership. Excuse my use of crippling acronym. It's not really trans-Pacific in a full sense, and it's not really a partnership, but it's what we're trying to build. And I would hope that we can put in place in the relatively near future a trans-Pacific partnership which includes China. At the moment, China is not actively involved in the definition and design of this. But I think over time they will have to be, or the structure will be absolutely meaningless. And as we try to build regional infrastructure, institutional infrastructure, some of which the Deputy Assistant Secretary was outlining earlier, all of which I think is very important. But I would urge that we not lose sight of the fundamental importance of continued economic cooperation and integration. And in fact, the markets of East Asia are already, if you look at it in terms of percentages, more highly integrated one with the other than our market. Striking. But that's because the private sectors in those countries have seen it to be in their interest to build these private production networks throughout the region. That's a fundamental feature of the emerging East Asian infrastructure. So we do have a few other problems we're going to have to be concerned about, one of which, of course, is North Korea. And we'd have to devote a whole evening to that discussion. But I think here, too, this is, in the end, this is a very important test of the ability of the U.S. and China to work together. Our interests fundamentally are quite similar, and our approaches should be very different. I think we could each learn a bit from the other, deciding how best to do on the fundamental problem that North Korea poses. North Korea is not going to collapse, at least we can't count on that. It's no longer a reasonable premise for American foreign policy. And North Korea is not going to suddenly decide that it really doesn't want nuclear weapons. I don't think that's a very realistic proposition. But we've not been able to come up with a rationale or reasonable example. It's very, very difficult country. But remember, North Korea is right at the heart, geographically, of this entire region, which is the most vibrant, vigorous economic region of the world. And North Korea is right there at the heart, and essentially it's a failed state. And its capacity to cause damage and instability throughout the region should not be underestimated. Thank you.
Steve, let me ask you one other question. Recently, the Chinese president visited South Korea.
Yes.
Rather interesting development, it seems to me, especially given the relationship between China and North Korea. What do you make of that? Inspired?
Can you make a comment on?
I'm not surprised by it. China made its strategic decision in 1992 and decided to recognize South Korea and build a relationship with them. China is now South Korea's most important trading partner. And North Korea does not really even have statistical significance in North Korea or China's view of global regional trade. But neither should we hope to convince China that its interests are best served by witnessing the collapse of North Korea, which is, in a sense, sort of an unspoken objective, has been for 25 years of U.S. policy toward. So I'm not at all surprised that China and Xi Jinping went to Seoul. I think that's a strong signal of the South Koreans that his view of China's long-term interests is the same as that of his predecessors. But they're not going to suddenly abandon North Korea, and we can't expect that they will.
Thank you.
Can I make a comment on the previous speaker? Can I? This is from Tokyo. Can I just make a short comment on what the previous speaker said?
I'd like you to hold it for the happenstance panels, if you would. And I want to call in an old friend, Professor Kosaku Yarakuno, who is the Dean of the School of Science and Economics at the University. He is with us from Tokyo. Rocky, there you are.
Well, anyway, thank you very much, Governor. Thank you very much, Governor. It's been a very interesting discussion about how to build what Pacific institution to resolve the dispute in this region. And then it is true that we have several international courts or tribunal, but actually these organizations really do not cannot solve the problem, especially when two sovereign powers do not agree about the claims over the islands or territories. So in that sense, we have to set up some kind of regional organization, regional institution to talk about in an amicable way to solve those disputes. So thing is, well, that we can use in the case of ASEAN Plus and the APEC, and we can take advantage every opportunity to get the Chinese government in the discussion, so that what's the critical factor which attract the Chinese government to participate? That's my question. So, well, within my time, well, the ambassador Fujisaki has a little comment. So,
can I make a comment?
Go ahead.
Bonnie Glasser said we are ready to go to tribunals. That's not true. On this island, we have been saying it's not a territorial issue. We don't have issue because it's like some country coming around Hawaii and saying that this is our island, but we're not saying, hey, this is not the territorial issue. Now, two things. We are talking about present and future. Present, two things are important. Try to be patient, not to be provocative. And but this is based on the conventional wisdom that all the countries would not really like to have war. The important thing is to avoid accidental war. But some people doubt that if this conventional wisdom is right, seeing what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in South Sea with Spratly, Paracel, it's not only Japan issue, Japan-China issue, but it's more of a global issue, regional issue. That's point one on present issue. Future issue, we totally agree with what the previous speaker said, that two things are important. One is to fortify what we have already, like Japan-US alliance, and this fall is important because we are discussing guidelines now. As for the future, also what's important is try to seek some international norm, as you have rightly been discussing, more of rules and order, international regulations, and for that, two things are important. As Steve Bosworth said, this is very important to come to agreement on TPP. Also, it's important to really have more substance in code of conduct, and from that point, it's a very critical time. Now, my good colleague Kondo-san would like to maybe say no to everything what I've said. So he will. Can I pass on to him?
Hi. Yes, okay. I'm a retired diplomat, and I'm running an institute on culture and diplomacy. I have two things to make. One, what is worrisome is 2 out of 5 permanent members of the Security Council are challenging or seem to be challenging the status quo. So we have to take a strong stance against those revisionists. Second, I agree with what has been said, trying to mitigate or contain the military risks around the nation, around the islands, or in the South Pacific area. But also, we have to continue and enhance cooperative relationship, cooperative regimes, not in political or economic areas, such as environment, disaster prevention, disaster mitigation, tourism, and by involving experts in various fields to establish a cooperative, forward-looking cooperative stance will help develop trust amongst the countries concerned. Thank you.
Great. I now want to go to Patrick Cronin, who I believe is Patrick. Where are you?
Governor, I've just returned from Malaysia and Indonesia, where I was speaking about some of these issues, especially in the South China Sea.
Go ahead.
Well, let me add to the many good remarks that have already been made. I agree with almost everything that's been said. Let me give you the good news and the bad news. The good news is that the Asia-Pacific region remains the enormous opportunity of the 21st century, and I think Ambassador Boswell captured it well by talking about growing the American economic and trade expansion through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, first sealing a deal with 12 countries, but then expanding to make it the inclusive rules-based trading system with the Chinese that we all hope it will become. So the good news is that the Asia-Pacific is not Ukraine, it's not Syria and Iraq, and these tensions in the maritime regions, in the near seas, if you will, of China, in both the East and the South China Seas, Glazer pointed out, except for accidents, is not likely to lead to a shooting war. That doesn't mean they're not increasingly fraught with peril, or that they're not important. Indeed, they are important. And Bonnie Glazer, I think, read off a really good list of many ideas that can be acted upon. So the question really is, why haven't some of these good ideas been seized? Why is there a political failure to capitalize on some of the thinking that has been expressed at many international conferences? And that's a tricky question. It's a loaded question because everybody has a different perspective. From my own perspective, we are dealing with an increasingly assertive China around its periphery. This can be justified as sensible from China's perspective. It has growing interests. It has growing capabilities. It has a history of being picked apart from its perspective. So from many ways you can rationalize it from a Chinese perspective, but nonetheless, I think it goes beyond the idea that Japan nationalized 3 islands in 2012, for instance, which, as Bonnie Glazer pointed out, no doubt that was a marker for growing Chinese assertiveness in the East China Sea. But if you look at the whole periphery around China, you can look at even where Xi Jinping, as he lands in India, they've got tents being pitched across the Indian territory. In the South China Sea, you have a deep-sea oil rig that had been unilaterally placed in disputed waters with Vietnam. You have the reclamation of submerged features to try to create artificial islands. You have the harassment of patrol and other aircraft in both the East and the South China Seas. All of these are, from my perspective, an indicator that China wants to have a greater say, a greater influence over its near seas, including rewriting the rules. And this may be really the problem here. China's not happy with the rules as they are. And while that may be a legitimate point from China's perspective, the question for the international community and for the U.S. and allies and friends is, well, what's the right way to go about changing rules if you don't like them? And that's really where the tension is. We don't like, in many ways, the manner in which China is going about the rules. So let's take the Philippine arbitration case in the South China Sea, which essentially is established for for all the signatories of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. That arbitral panel can rule in early 2016 that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is essentially at odds with the Chinese declaration of a 9-dash line, because it's not based on contemporary international law in land features, for instance. Nonetheless, we can't do anything about it. There's no enforcement mechanism. There's nothing that could force China to change. So we're in a quandary about how to persuade the Chinese. So what do we need to do? We obviously all need better engagement with the Chinese. Unfortunately, that's not been sufficient to date. Even in the U.S.-China relationship, as a senior official told me just a couple of weeks ago, there's no touchstone for cooperation in the U.S.-China relationship. And we have to find that equilibrium. And so far it's been elusive, it's been difficult. The Japan-China relationship is showing signs of getting a stronger dialogue right now, but I fear that it may be very short-lived, that you may have a certain superficial quality to it, but it may be something that is fragmented by the spring of next year. The ASEAN-based institutions, as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Michael Fuchs talked about, there's no doubt that the array of institutions emanating out of the 10 Southeast Asian countries offer a venue, offer legitimacy, but as I just found out in Malaysia and Indonesia, there's no courageous perception that they can take on these issues. In fact, just the opposite. They want the United States to lower the tone, lower the idea that there's deterrence, that there could even be costs or penalties on bad behavior, on coercion in the East and South China Seas. They want to focus instead on the cooperation. And we do too, I think, and I think the United States' overall strategy has to be one of growing our own presence economically, politically, first and foremost, in order to help shape this region positively, to bring our friends and allies together to deal with these issues. But we're going to have to avoid these dangerous incidents. We're going to have to avoid digging ourselves deeper in holes by military buildups on islands that are disputed, or by taking actions that are clearly provocative and unilateral changes of the status quo. That's how I see it. It may be a bleaker picture than we've heard so far, but that's my assessment.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you. Folks, we're moving along here, and I want to make sure that our other participants have an opportunity to be part of this. So I want to turn now to Joe Nye, old friend and former dean of the Kennedy School, who's talked a lot about these kinds of issues and worked on them over the years. But Joe, you've got a number of people that you're going to be introducing and bringing in this discussion. So welcome aboard.
Well, thanks, Mike. Let me senior officials recently. And what strikes me is that, in principle, China has realized that it has an interest in using its soft power. If you are growing in hard power, military and economic capacity, the way China has, you're likely to frighten your neighbors into coalitions against you. But if you can combine your hard power with soft power, attraction and persuasion, you make those coalitions less likely. And Hu Jintao said this in 2007 when he addressed the 17th Party Congress. He said China needs to invest more in its soft power. And they have done that. They've spent billions of dollars on Confucius Institutes and turning CCTV into an Al Jazeera of the world and so forth. The trouble is that it's difficult to combine hard and soft power together so they don't cancel each other out. The United States has made mistakes on this. The invasion of Iraq, for example, was very successful in hard power terms, very destructive to our soft power. But China faces a similar problem. They're concerned about American containment or America creating alliances against them, and then they are doing actions with their hard power which are driving all these countries into America's arms. And they don't quite know how to get out of this. For example, if you take the Philippines, you set up Confucius Institute in Manila to make yourself attractive. Traditional Chinese culture is very attractive. And then you use your hard power to drive Philippine boats out of Scarborough Reef. And guess what happens? Instead of the Confucius Institute making China attractive in the Philippines, you get a very strong anti-Chinese sentiment over what is a little bunch of rocks. It is a very counterproductive strategy. And if you think of the alternative, usually when I ask my Chinese friends about this, they say, well, we have no choice. This is sovereign territory. We can't give this up. So what they're doing is sacrificing their larger influence in the region for a bunch of rocks. And you'd say, well, if those rocks are sitting on enormous amounts of petroleum or gas, maybe it's worth it. But as Holly Morrow has just published, that's not really the case. So think of a better strategy for China. Suppose China were to take the suggestions that Michael Fuchs and Bonnie Glaser and others have made and say, yes, we'll go for a binding code of conduct in the South China Sea. And we'll agree that in the East China Sea, this is a proposal that Kevin Rudd and I published in the Washington Post last spring, we'll agree that the Diaoyu Senkaku or Senkaku Diaoyu Islands should be put off for a future generation. In the meantime, they should not be militarized or inhabited, but turned into a marine ecological preserve. And if you had this larger perspective, China's natural influence in the region, which grows out of its overwhelming economic strength and those trade ties that Steve Bosworth was mentioning earlier, will lead it to a much better position than it's in now. So one of the real puzzles is, why does China, if it has the wisdom that was expressed by Hu Jintao at the 17th Party Congress, if it has the wisdom to combine soft power with hard power to create a smart power strategy, why hasn't it done it? Instead, what it's doing is a counterproductive strategy, which is driving all its neighbors into the arms of the United States in the exact opposition to what it says are its objectives. So I would suggest that the real question that we ought to think about is, how can China really implement what Hu Jintao said in 2007, and which Xi Jinping has repeated, and develop a smart power strategy? That would be good for China, be good for the U.S., and good for the region as a whole. I hope that's provocative enough to stir some.
It would sell your book, too.
No, the book's already selling more than enough.
So we have some people who are participating with you. You might want to introduce one or two of those folks.
Okay, well, to bring others into this, let me suggest that Ambassador Kondo, Zichi Kondo, who's Special Advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and is in Tokyo, might be willing to add his thoughts with this.
Hi, I'm Seiichi Kondo. I'm co-author of this book, Soft Power, Superpowers. Remember, well, the point I want to make is that I don't think China really understands what soft power means. Soft power is a kind of secret weapon. But what they have been doing is to explicitly use their culture and the Confucius institutions to attract others. But it is very clear what is behind this. So I don't like to talk too much about soft power of Japan because, as I said, it is a secret weapon. So I don't think China is really fully understanding the power of soft power. It's a kind of propaganda still. It's a stage of propaganda. So I hope Professor Nai will persuade them that what soft power really is. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We also are fortunate to have Professor Suzanne Ogden here with us. Professor and Interim Chair of the Department of Political Science at Northeastern University. Suzanne, would you like to join in?
Just a brief statement. I think Japan has to think about their soft power too. Japan doesn't really do enough to project its own soft power? What is the equivalent of the Confucian Institutes throughout the world that China is doing? What is the equivalent of the millions of Chinese who are going abroad to study, as opposed to very, very few Japanese who are going abroad? We don't interact with the Japanese. We have thousands of, tens of thousands of Chinese students and scholars in the United States. We meet them. We're very impressed by them. We learn a lot about them. But we don't get that from Japan, and I think Japan needs to be out there more. They need to increase their own soft power and project it. Japan's soft power right now comes from their technology, from things like their culture, their manga, their anime, but they need more projections.
And let me
Can I respond to that?
Yes, please.
Well, I can't really agree with you more. But what is even more important is to invite young people, young artists to Japan, because the power of soft power of Japan lies in nature, people, lifestyle, and all business and streets, clean streets, and so on. It is very difficult to explain this, all those things in words. But if you are here in Japan for 6 months, you will really love it, and you will understand what the real soft power of Japan is. So, of course, sending more students, people abroad, but inviting even more people to Japan to really feel the soft power of Japan. And 2020 Olympic and Paralympic Games, this is a great opportunity for us to do that.
Well, the nice thing about soft power is the win-win. If the attractiveness of Japan goes up in Beijing, and the attractiveness of China goes up in Tokyo, that's a win for both countries, and also in our benefit as well. But let's get a Chinese perspective on some of this question. And Zheng He is here. Perhaps we could invite you to give your perspective.
It is my great pleasure to be here to discuss this issue. Actually, I'm not an international affairs expert. I'm a Chinese politics expert. But I think that up to now, the Chinese government hope to get political legitimacy from the good governance domestically through more transparent policy making process and more involvement and more empowerment by citizens. This is good sign. For international politics, I think that the good governance is also very important. Also, the international institutions meeting process involved all the stakeholders, they have equal seat, and how to make the international institution meeting process more transparent is very important. More conversation, more cooperation, more compromise. It will be a solution rather than confrontation and so on. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. But do you think it would be possible to see China accepting the kind of binding code of conduct for settlement of disputes over islands within the 9-dash line that Bonnie Glaser mentioned tonight? Can you imagine that being acceptable or not?
I think that actually the diplomatic practice is a kind of also kind of trial, error, and line. Really, yeah. But you know that if you have your policies, but it feedback, and then maybe it's a time, it's opportunity to change it. So for China, if maximize its own national interests, so I think that thinking cooperation, conversation is the better choice.
Professor John Quelch of the business school is, I don't know whether he's not with us physically tonight, but is he?
Yes, he got it.
Oh, so he's sick, so he will not be able to join us. But shall we maybe we can ask Andrew.
Thanks, Joe. Good to see you again after 6 years. I went to grad school here, and I remember seminars in this room. I'm so happy to be back. I have a few points that are coming off of what people have said. The first I'd make is that I don't think ASEAN is really a good location to solve the South China Sea dispute. China is clearly breaking international law for its own aggrandizement in terms of maritime territory, and ASEAN has within it Myanmar and Cambodia, which are essentially near client states of China. They're blocking any real moves by the ASEAN Corporation organization. The TPP and APEC are great ideas. I'm not sure how much influence they're going to have positively on the situation, as sometimes those kinds of Chinese economic access to countries greases the rails essentially for their influence, and they use that influence to stop any sort of confrontation against the types of aggrandizement that they're doing in the South China Sea. I think that U.S. allies are worried. I think that they're worried about the commitment of the United States if it came to war with China. And look at Scarborough Shoal. China has occupied Philippine territory essentially, or exclusive economic zone for 2 years, and we really haven't done much about it at all. Definitely haven't done anything militarily about it. And I think that gives people pause about our commitments, our defense commitments to those countries. What I think we need to do is take a stronger stance. But what the United States should do is take a stronger stance in terms of its bilateral treaties. I think we should go beyond a bilateral treaty and have a strong multilateral defense treaty in Asia. I think that we should include Japan. I think we should include South Korea, the United States, Australia, New Zealand. Basically, better democracies, because I think that's key in Asia. I think we should also have a partnership for peace program similar to that of NATO in Europe. I think a lot of the other democracies in the region should be included in that partnership for peace program, and will significantly strengthen the multilateral defense organization. U.S. to China defense expenditures right now are roughly 4 to 1. For every dollar China spends, the U.S. and our allies in Asia spend about 4. That's a big difference. We have the military power to stop China's expansions, but we're not using it. North Korea, of course, is another major threat. It's not just China. As far as Chinese legitimacy, I think China can gain legitimacy in the international arena by following international law. And I think it will. I think as long as China breaks international law, I think that countries that are being hurt by that will see China as a criminal, and I think other countries will see China as a criminal as well.
And it sounds to me like this is a new Cold War. Or am I exaggerating?
It's a dangerous situation. You've got Russia and China expanding territorially, right? And with military force, because China is using its navy against these small countries, and it's a very dangerous situation.
So we're going to surround them with military alliances, right?
I think we should have a strong democratic military alliance, just as we do in Europe.
Dick Rosecrans, you should get in this, but so should Holly Morrow, who has written a very good article about this.
Although that's not what I want to talk about.
All right, let's Dick go next.
It does seem to be we're at a choice point, and as some people around the table know, including particularly Joe, we've just finished a book on World War I and its implications for the future. if something as bad as World War I can have occurred in 1914, are we sure that something like that could never occur again? Especially since when we look at the causes of World War I, none of them were inevitable. Things that happened actually had to happen. So we have to worry about something that is also accidental, causing conflict between ourselves and China over time. We have to take that very seriously. I would like to move away from international law. I think we will never solve anything in the Pacific through international law. Each of these countries has their own economic zone, China, which overlaps with China's 9 dotted line, so there's inevitably going to be conflict there. There is no international court that will resolve that conflict. That's simply going to go on. So what we should be doing in Asia is to move from de jure to de facto, instead of trying to solve things at the international legal level. We should work together to work practically on solutions. For example, without deciding who owns the Senkaku to the Diaoyu Islands, it would be possible for China and Japan to work on developing a lattice work of drilling operations in the area nearby, so they can actually share what comes out of that area without having to decide finally who owns it, because they will never decide who owns it. The same sort of thing is probably true in Scarborough Shoal. It's true in terms of Vietnam and so on. So I would encourage de facto to supersede de jure. And also, let me make one more comment. China will never be a member of TPP as long as these disputes are going on. It will never be allowed to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Only if these issues are settled in one way or another, and it need not be legal, it can be settled informally. Will it be at all likely that China can join in the great advantages of TPP? When you consider that in the longer term, the basic thrust of Chinese trade is not in East Asia. The components have been added, the final goods have been assembled. They all go out to a worldwide market in Europe, in the United States, and other countries. And those kinds of things are crucial in the long term for China. So joining TPP could be very, very helpful to China, but it's not going to work unless there's some concrete agreements that allow other countries to participate with China in TPP.
Holly?
Maybe as a counterpoint to what was just said about international law, a number of people brought up points about how when Americans make that point, though, is that the U.S. has not ratified UNCLOS. So if we talk about...
We're obeying it.
What's that?
We're obeying it.
But that's different from ratifying.
Well, still.
And there's...
It's again de facto, not de jure.
But I think we are on tenuous ground, and we are seen as being on tenuous moral ground when we lecture Asian states, China or anybody else, about the importance of obeying a rules-based system based on UNCLOS, which is a treaty that we have not ourselves signed. So I would just make a push, as I have made in Washington for many years, that to be a proponent of this, we actually have to walk the walk, if you will, and ratify UNCLOS. Even though I know there's no real...
You got to get the Senate on your side.
Well, we had, I think, exhausted our time for this panel, but Mike, you want to hand it over to Kevin?
I do. We're fortunate to have the former Prime Minister of Australia with us, and I'm going to turn the rest of our session over to him. So, Kevin, you're on.
Good. Thank you very much, Governor, and Joe and I, and distinguished colleagues who are here. I've been asked to talk about what we do about the broader future of the Asia-Pacific region, and specifically to talk about the possible long-term concept of an Asia-Pacific community. The reason I'm late tonight is that I've just been attending the graduating function for one of the classes sent here by the organization department of the Chinese Communist Party, who have been here for the last 2 weeks. They saw Joe Nye earlier this afternoon and told me all sorts of good things that you had to say, Joe, and some of the bad things as well. And their evaluation of my performance in the same class was about of a similar time. But the reason I raise that is because the central part in the future regional equation is, of course, how China views its own future. And that was very much the subject of Joe's discussion with this very senior ministers from the party structure. And it has been a useful thing that Harvard University has been doing, not just with this group, but over many years now, 500 such people have gone through similar training courses at this great university. What I might do is simply talk to 4 points. The first is this, concerning what I think is the current state of the US-China relationship, which exists at the cockpit of the future stability. Then I might talk briefly about what can we learn in the centenary of World War I from the experience of the Europeans in the world about how to avoid unnecessary conflagration and conflict. And thirdly, I might talk about where East Asia has got to so far on the question of regional institutions. And then finally, some thought lines on this that I've had myself over the last several years, back to my period as Australian Prime Minister, about how we begin to change what the Chinese would describe as the sui, the pattern of thought about how we could construct a common future together. Let me start with the first, which is the current state of US-China relations. Joe has been looking at this for many years. I've been looking at this for many years. I've been looking at it primarily as either a diplomatic or political practitioner, himself as a distinguished scholar with a very significant reputation in China itself. My judgment is that the relationship at present is probably in its most difficult state that it's been in normalization. It should not be thus, for the simple reason that there are so many things in common between the two countries, but nonetheless it is thus when you start to talk to senior Chinese leaders and foreign policy leaders about the current state of the relationship. You can easily put together a list of what currently might be problematic in the relationship, but actually I think it's much more fundamental than that. It goes to both Chinese perceptions about their own and America's future in East Asia going out to the mid-century point, and America's perception of China doing the same. And reduced to its absolute essential, there is a high, profound, and I believe dangerous level of strategic mistrust between the two at this point. Of course, this is no one's fault in particular, it is a reality. And as someone from a third country, a friend of China and an ally of the United States, I've sought to bring a slightly different perspective on what could possibly be done about it. Which brings me to my second point. China, which is a deeply scholarly culture, spends a lot of time researching the rise and fall of great powers in history, not just in Asia but in Europe, and also patterns which emerge from historical analysis over time. For example, China in the last 10 years has produced this extraordinary series on Central Chinese television on the rise and fall of great powers. I think either an 8 or 12-part series, I can't remember whether it was 8 or 12, but quite a profound level of analysis as to why empires rise and why they fall. Starting with the Greeks and finishing with the British, and then to the present period, with a huge question mark about themselves in a country well known and loved by many of us around this table, namely the United States of America. And so when the Chinese look at historical evolution, they've been captured in part by the broadly called the Thucydides trap, whereby when an emerging power begins to challenge an established power, an established great power, then it creates a particular set of behaviors which are intrinsically destabilizing, which produce two classical forms: either the emerging power seeking to preempt action against it by the established power, or by the established power seeking to rise of the emerging power by preempting first. And the historical precedents given there are Athens and Sparta, and more recently, in the First World War period, Germany and Russia, Germany and Britain. The interesting conclusion that I draw from the First World War, which is, I think, shared by many Chinese scholars, is that how, in fact, can the Thucydides trap be avoided? Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, has explicitly referred to this in his own speechmaking. That is, how do we escape necessarily the fault lines and the predictabilities and some of the verities of history and create a different future? His concept, which he describes as a new type of great power relationship, is a headline still waiting to be populated, but it is an explicit attempt to construct something different from the usual predictable great power clashes that we've seen littered across history. The study of World War I is particularly because the conclusions I draw from that, and that a number of Chinese scholars draw from that, but I'd be not truthful to say that it's widespread across the Chinese academy. So one of the reasons we had the events of 1914, one, not all, was the absence of any effective European-wide institution at that time. In fact, the systems of global dispute resolutions had barely begun through various international institutions established the previous year in The Hague. And we had not even begun to fashion the League of Nations, let alone the United Nations. But within Europe itself, and they took us into this war through all the historical factors we're familiar with, one of the great problems was frankly, the faulty nature of diplomatic communication at the time, and the absence of intermediating powers or institutions capable of ensuring that communications were correct, accurate, and informed. I don't wish to misrepresent history. That's not the single causative power. But in the critical events of 1914 through August and into the early days of September, I think it was a significant contributing factor. Now, the Europeans on this question, and I hope I'm not offending anyone around the table, but I'm Australian, we do that professionally anyway, is they're slow learners, and so we had a second great conflagration as well, called the Second World War. And eventually the Europeans concluded, particularly France and Germany, that this was a generally dumb idea. Having been through the Franco-Prussian War, the First World War, and the Second World War, with the combined carnage approaching something in the vicinity of 50 million. I'm looking at Richard here to nod his head whether I've got the collective number right from those three conflagrations. And so statesmen after the First World War decided that European institutionalism would be a factor which would reduce the risk of such conflict in the future. If you look at the modest beginnings of what we call the European Union, and starting with the Coal and Steel Agreement of 1954, essentially a Franco-German agreement, to what then became a common market, which in turn became a European community and which ultimately became a European Union. The strategic objective which people like Adenauer and Schuman had at the time, I think was in time realized, and that is the thought now of France and Germany ever taking up arms against each other is now so out of the range of conceptual possibilities as to be ridiculous. If we asked that question in 1945, 1950, or even 1955, I think given we'd had so many repeat performances, that would not necessarily have been the feud. So I pay tribute to the statesmen of that period, from 45 to 55, French and German in particular, socialist and conservative. Which brings us to the question of the Asia-Pacific region and on the question of institutionalism. If you look at what's evolved in Europe since 1945 through European, let's call it pan-institutionalism, the European Union itself, the CSCE, ultimately becoming the OSCE, and various other Europe-wide institutions. The parallel developments in the Asia-Pacific region have been very thin to non-existent. If you look at our region, and when I say our, I mean Australia's region. We've seen the evolution of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, good in itself. The fact is that particular culture of regional institutionalism, it's turned former adversaries into, frankly, colleagues, but the possibility of the concept of large-scale war between them, that is the 10 Southeast Asian states, by and large is now much more remote than it ever was. But remember in 1975 when ASEAN was first conceived, or 76 if I'm correct, when it first became more fully formed, it actually dates from earlier exercises in the late 60s, it was seen then primarily as an anti-communist bloc by Western-leaning pro-military dictatorships against communist Indochina. But the development of concepts of community, of even common security community, I won't say common values, because that overstretches it if you look at entities such as Indonesia, Singapore, and Vietnam, and Burma. It has been, I think, at a sub-regional level, quite a remarkably successful institution. Because since the fall of Saigon, leaving aside the border clash between Cambodia and Vietnam a couple of years later, amongst the Southeast Asians, it's been conflict-free. However, if we looked at the map more broadly across wider East Asia, institutionalism has frankly been much thinner on the ground. There evolved out of ASEAN something called the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is to have a loose dialogue on pan-regional security questions. That was an Australian diplomatic initiative from one of my predecessors, Gareth Evans. If you look at the evolution, in fact, beginning with the Chinese, of ASEAN +3 becoming ASEAN +6, and in turn becoming the East Asia Summit, which now includes the United States, you have the evolution of a thin institution, but nonetheless one which exists on paper. More broadly across the region, however, you have at an economic level APEC, again an Australian diplomatic initiative by Bob Hawke and later Paul Keating, which has had a huge role in, frankly, establishing as an orthodoxy within wider East Asia the necessity of having open economies and open markets in a region where that was not previously the orthodoxy. And I think APEC has been a very useful catalytic institution in that respect. But an integrated institution which embraces the political, foreign whole of the century, namely wider East Asia, including India, there isn't much to speak of. Which brings me to my final point. What then can be done? For some time, a bit like a voice in the wilderness, I have argued a proposition that we should begin thinking about, conceptualizing, and then advancing in practice the idea of an Asia-Pacific community. Its first stepping stone has already been established through some reasonable diplomacy, which I had a role in the lead up to 2010, which was finally getting the East Asian Summit partners to agree to America joining. And that was an administration decision then to accept that invitation in 2010, given historical patterns of US behavior in Asia was, we don't do multilateralism, you guys do that, we just do bilateral alliances. Some of us who were defenders of America thought this was not entirely mindful of how the region would unfold over time. And I helped, I think, in my own way to lead that charge. Anyway, getting the 10 Southeast Asians, the 3 Northeast Asians, China, Korea, and Japan, and 3 others, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, to agree to America entering this institution was a significant, as seen within the region, breakthrough. The interesting thing about the EAS, as it's called within East Asia, 2 advantages. One, it has an open mandate. If you look at its founding principles in 2005, it can address political, economic, security, foreign policy, and any other matter which leaders deem to be relevant to the region's future. It's called the Kuala Lumpur Declaration. The second thing is that for the first time we have a nascent institution in Asia which has all the principles around the table. Because the great danger prior to that was that you'd have a bifurcated Pacific with simply the East Asians, grand regional institutions, and America carved out. But now you have America, and now you have the East Asians, and of course Russia is there as well. So what I've argued since 2008 on is that we should, over time, evolve a concept of an Asia-Pacific community. And I'm very mindful of European presidents here in simply taking things slowly, step by step. But the value of a galvanizing vision for the long term is it actually points political and strategic energies in a particular direction, even if you can't realize its immediate material manifestation at all levels. So, the fact that we have, through the East Asia Summit process, got the participants right and got the mandate right, now requires the next step, which is turning it into a more robust regional institution, and therefore evolving into something which I'd call an Asia-Pacific community. My final point is this. Partly this, I wish to be realist about this and say it doesn't fundamentally resolve realist strategic concerns either on the part of the Americans or Chinese or others within the region, in areas where at present there is no common strategic agreement. But what it does do is that it begins over time to create the culture of common security dialogue, common foreign policy discourse, common political conversation about the region's common future. And that, prior to 1954, didn't really exist in Europe. And I've got to say, when I look at that example, I look at what we could do in the Asia-Pacific, and frankly, it's capable, I think, of producing some genuine positive outcomes for the future. It is not a panacea. It is one part of a broader fabric in dealing with, I think, the current fragile and delicate and perhaps deteriorating state of the US-China relationship. And if we can have that as part of our armory and our software for the future, developing step by step a culture of strategic cooperation, beginning in such practical areas as common preparation and engagement for the next major natural disaster in East Asia, because we have them at a large scale every year, where all the militaries are working together, the PLA, USAF and the rest, and the Royal Australian Air Force and the Indonesians and whomever, and the Japanese Self-Defense Force, on the next big one, whether it's a Fukushima-type incident, whether it's an earthquake in Sichuan, or whether it's out-of-control fires in Australia, which take out a large city. This begins to create, shall I say, the culture, atmosphere, and spirit of common regional enterprise. So those are the thoughts I'd like to leave you with in particular this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Prime Minister, can I say a word? It was good to meet you in Tokyo at an HPAIR meeting.
Yeah, we did.
Yes, just a couple of points. One, there's very much attention of APEC summit if Abe and Xi Jinping will meet or not. I think there's a bit of too much of that, because President Obama and Xi Jinping met for 8 hours last August, but still not everything was solved. So I think we should not really try to see if that summit happened between Xi Jinping and Abe, it's going to be a panacea or euphoria and solve everything. I think we have to be very patient. Second point is that we should always keep the door open, such as TPP. Second, we should not try to create at this moment an institution like NATO, because that would be seen as too much antagonistic, and it's also not realistic in view of the Japan-Korea relations as well. So I think we should try to use what is there and try to build upon from there. Third point, it's a little presumptuous to put this in front of father of soft power, Jonai, but I think talking about soft power, you have to know that its essence of that is your founding fathers' principles: democracy, freedom of speech, and rules of law. And so it is there a contradiction of Chinese policy and soft power, because if we think of the essence of soft power, it's not only manga or anime, it's more of that philosophy. But I think I've spoken too long, so I'll finish.
We certainly are going to have a lot to talk about as we move ahead. I must say, however, Mr. Ambassador, I'm not sure the remilitarization of Japan is a way to create the kind of culture that Prime Minister Rudd is talking about either. So we've got a lot to talk about. We have a couple of people who I would hope would make a comment or two, and then we'll wrap things up. And let's begin with Ling Chen.
Thank you. You're the Prime Minister here, and as far as the oral panel.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Our panel has been very informative, and just some quick comments. I think we probably sometimes have to distinguish between what China is trying to let the world really doing and what it wanted or would do. So what it was perceived is doing is still largely a peaceful rise of China. Well, maybe not so much compared to the previous Xi Jinping regime. The Xi Jinping regime has more issues in terms of the South China Sea, but still largely so. What it is actually doing is, I think, sort of trying having a trade-off between the hard power and the soft power, as Professor Knight just mentioned, that it is trying to throw up its soft power whenever it's possible, building up the Confucius institutions all over the world. But when it really comes to the question of hard power, whether it will concede to in terms of territory, whether it will concede on territory, is still pretty harsh. Because once it concedes, we all want the problems to be solved peacefully, but once it concedes, it also have the internal problem of Tibet and Xinjiang problem, and it's all about territory. It's all about territory. So once conceded about territory occurs, there's other issue involved, not just South China Sea. It's all tied up together. And what we wish, and if we're doing what we think it is doing, is another question. Whether there's not going to be a Cold War or another, World War, and as some of the comments has mentioned, we do not know. And that's precisely why it's very useful to get on kinds of.
Thank you. Llewellyn King, you with us?
Yes, here I am.
Two comments before we wrap up.
Well, I think the Prime Minister did a fabulous job. And really, if you mind what the Prime Minister said and what Joe and I said, we have a chance of a vision of something in which everybody can rest. It's a large concept of the future, a vision of the future, and not a vision of the future, a vision where Asia, I was around in the early days of the European experiment, and people could talk about it. They weren't enthusiastic, but they could talk about it. There was a vision out there of a different way. I have not, except for me, Prime Minister, heard really of a vision of a different way. And I think your idea of the Asian community is superb because it leaves room for Joe's soft power. It leaves room for intellectual experimentation, discussion, and for that thing which is so human, to want to be included, rather than necessarily being angry for being de facto excluded, which is something that happens among countries. The European Union has not worked perfectly, but it has been a huge advance in terms of European security, and I think it's very, very much worth looking at.
Kevin, quick comment.
60 seconds to respond to my good friend, the Japanese ambassador. One is on Xi Jinping and Abe in Beijing. My belief is that they will certainly meet. Whether they agree on a future summit's a separate question. I think the temperature is, by mutual design, coming down because they realize the risks, both economic and political, by allowing this to get out of control are too great. My second response is, and where I deeply disagree with you, Ambassador, is not to try a new regional institutional approach. The bilateral mechanisms are failing across Asia, and therefore the rest of Asia does not want to find its security ultimately exclusively hostage to the dynamics of the Sino-Japanese relationship. As a consequence, you can build other trust mechanisms by having us focus on a common regional future. Some of the building blocks are already there, and I would certainly welcome Japan becoming fully engaged with the evolution of such a regional vision.
I'm sorry, Mr. Prime Minister, I totally agree with you. I said we should not make an institution which would exclude China. So we would have to start thinking about multilateralizing our institutions, but with China in the future, not maybe right now. Second, Abe and Xi Jinping, I think they'll meet as well, and I think it's very good also. But it's, of course, better than not meeting. But we should not put too much expectation that it will solve all issues. It's maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
I just want to say that. Thank you very much. I'm not disagreeing with you, and thank you very much for the 4 points.
Let me wrap up what has been a fascinating evening by simply saying, based on my own experience, excluding anybody is usually a mistake if you're thinking about bringing people together. And as John Maynard Keynes once said, in the long run we're all dead. Having celebrated my 80th birthday, I'm not sure personally I'm prepared to wait for years before we bring China into this process. Well, in fact, I think it ought to be happening right now. In any event, I think this sets the stage for our next conference in November. I want to say thank you to all of you, both here and around the world, who have participated with us. Kevin, thank you for giving us at least a conceptual framework that we can dig into. And a special thanks to Tuan Wen for making all of this possible. Thank you all very much, and thank you for joining us.
No,